Hi, welcome back to the Skylark song by J.M. Frey. It's time for chapter 13. They were silent until their glasses were empty. The Coyote, it seemed, in quiet shame, and Robin in furious chugging thought, so lost in the gears and cogs of her mind that she jumped when the Coyote stood and put his hands on the back of her chair. It seemed to be a clear signal that whatever sort of charade this dinner was meant to be, it was over, because the door opened and half a dozen navy blue uniformed soldiers descended on the room, clearing their dessert plates, collecting glasses, and standing at attention at various spots around the room. Robin jumped up too. She couldn't bear the thought of him hovering over her exposed neck. He'd already shown a penchant for putting his hands around it, after all. The Coyote reached out, and without so much as a please, took her hand and placed it in the crook of his arm with a pointed look. Officious, high-handed ass! Robin forced her fingers into a flex, countering the desire to pinch down hard and maybe try to rip at the sensitive bundle of tendons under his skin. Perhaps he was a prisoner, but there was also the possibility that he was lying to her. All she knew for sure was that he had shot down dozens of her colleagues, and she wasn't going to trust him, not as easily as all that. Not because he'd simply asked her and spun her a fancy tale, not until she knew for sure what it was that was actually happening inside these walls. The Coyote escorted her back into the same long hallway the seneschal had brought her down, though with her limp it became more of a slow shuffle than the graceful promenade of the nobility. The Coyote's gait was stiff with performance and his own unseen bruises, and Robin wondered how much of the show was for her benefit, made for the sole purpose of garnering her favor, and how much of it was for their captors, whoever they may be. Assuming he was to be believed, of course, and was not himself her true captor. She was starting to cultivate a headache trying to unravel this knot. He led her along the hall and selected, seemingly on a whim, another door identical to the one that had opened to the dining room. This time they entered a small salon, the sort where a family might spend their evenings in a rousing game of cards, or playing with the children, or reading to one another. The Coyote released Robin's arm as soon as they stepped inside, and turned immediately to the door to begin a conversation in low, rapid Klonnish with the seneschal, who had followed them with fresh glasses, the wine bottle, and a thick folio. Robin took several deliberate steps away from them, just to see if he would let her. She'd test boundaries all she running well wanted, and to hells with what he commanded about that. Neither man paid her any mind. They seemed to have decided that, in this particular cage, it was safe to let her off her leash. So she turned to take in the room. This one was also decorated in the colors of the Klonn, all icy blues and pale greens, and so artificial. The furniture was stiff and ornately carved. Robin ached for the warm earth tones preferred by her own people, or even the rich reds and oranges and yellows that made the Bene nobility look like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind when they walked down the streets. She missed overstuffed sofas and plain chairs with deep seats and the flickering flash of sparkling thread embroidered into everything. Above the massive fireplace on the far wall was a large painting, a family. The man looked remarkably like the Coyote, though his eyes were a deeper, richer blue, his face narrower, his cheeks more gaunt, his facial hair fussier. There was a little boy who stood beside him, while a woman she presumed to be their mother sat in the front, holding a chubby toddler with an affable expression. The eldest boy had silvery eyes and held himself stiff, his lip curled with familiar disdain. Robin had doubted that someone like the Coyote could ever have been a child, but here was the proof. The woman was beautiful, with a sort of beatific radiance that shone out of the canvas. Robin saw the same peace and joy in the younger boy, a cloud of black curls ringing his head, a slightly mischievous curl to the side of his pillowy baby lips. The gears in her mind whirred and whirled, and a foggy understanding began to take shape. Robin peered over at the Coyote again. He stood in the doorway still, signing a small stack of papers that were balanced in the seneschal's leather folder. "They," the seneschal was saying, "you may have this. It is acceptable." His words were heavily accented, but undoubtedly Saskwyan, which meant he wanted her to hear it, to understand him. which also meant that he'd understood everything they'd said over dinner. There was more in Clonnish, and Robin wished that she'd been afforded the training the other officers had been offered in regards to communication with the enemy. Perhaps if she'd been given more time, if their need to get her into the sky as soon as possible hadn't been so urgent, she would have been. Anxiety over what their hosts might have planned next warred with the need to keep pretending to be whatever it is that the Coyote wanted of her. Docile? Vapid? She still wasn't sure what her role in all of this was supposed to be. Robin hobbled towards a table set against the window, where a board of alternating white and black squares was laid out with little carvings of courtiers and kings and knights. She pretended to study them as she cased the latch on the window pane, eyes drawn to the bars and fresh cement that held them to the outside wall. Frozen turds, she thought. This window, too. They've got this all figured out, haven't they? Do you know this game, my dear? The Coyote asked over her shoulder, and Robin startled. She winced and sucked in a deep breath as both her ribs and her ankle protested. The thick carpeting had prevented her from hearing his approach. He was just a few steps away, the bottle and glasses in his hands. The seneschal had left the room, the door firmly closed once more. There was a loud, obvious click as it was locked from the outside. Hells. Alone at last. Or are we? Robin wondered. She resisted the urge to upend the table and scream. No, I don't know the game, she said instead, grating the words out between clenched teeth. The Coyote waved her into the seat opposite him with a magnanimity that bordered on the hostile. For all the farce of being treated like a guest, she was still being given orders to obey. She sat. He handed her the wine glass. It is a war game, the Coyote explained. Now that she could see him head on, she could catalog his bruise in full. It spread from his hairline to his jaw, and was getting darker every moment, the flesh around it raw and red with tiny scraped pricks. Someone kicked him, Robin realized. Kicked him right in the face. Good gods. Probably knocked him down and booted him a few times too, the way he's holding his side. It is called chess, he went on when Robin didn't say anything, too horrified by her revelation to reply. It is a game of strategy and patience. I am very good at both. He looked up at Robin over the board, eyes glittering, and Robin understood that he wasn't talking about just the game. He was patient. That much was clear. He'd been playing this game, this give and take with their captors, for a long time. Hells, this is probably his house, Robin thought, glancing again at the painting over the mantel. Have they taken it over, or is all of this a ruse? Is he victim, as he pretends to be, or master, as the painting implies? The headache got a bit tighter, perching right between her eyes. I like strategy as well, he said. Take, for instance, Pyrrhia. He studied her face for her reaction, so she bit the insides of her cheeks and gave him none. Did he know that's where she'd grown up? Was this some kind of bait? It is the closest city to the southern border. At the advent of the war, it became an industrial town. He spread his spider fingers and smiled. And then we bombed it. With no factories, there are no jobs, and with no jobs, people start to become frugal, and then desperate. Your home nation is eating itself alive, my dear. Robin thought of Mama without her loom, and of her own scavenging expeditions. She thought of the neighbors who'd lost their thumbs and hated the man who sat smiling before her, so smugly pleased at his own cleverness. People are suffering in Pyrrhia, she snapped. He frowned, looking at her with shrewd, calculating gaze. Indeed. Our strategy held true. He was still for a long moment, assessing her, and then, as if he'd come to the conclusion that her righteous anger was entirely dismissible, he looked back at the board and explained how each of the pieces could be maneuvered. Robin wanted to fight with him, against him in his flippant affirmation, against his pride in the atrocities he'd orchestrated, But the ease with which he'd maneuvered past the opportunity for her to do so quashed her ability to respond as she'd like. The topic was closed. And his posture, his intent attention to the game pieces, said that it would not reopen anytime soon. The rules of the war game seemed ridiculously complicated, but Robin paid attention because it was better than letting her mind roam over her inability to pin this slippery bastard down. Every time she thought she was confident she despised him, he'd go and say something else that ruined it, and every time she resolved to pity him, he'd do the same in the other direction. "Shall we begin, then?" he asked. Robin blinked at him. "What, you mean actually play?" "Well, of course," he chuckled, and it held only the faintest thread of strain. "I was not lying when I said that I enjoyed chess." Robin swallowed hard, eyes bouncing around the board. I don't think that I... If it will make it easier for you to understand, I shall play first." Robin nodded, mouth dry, with worry that it was some sort of test she was about to fail. She took a gulp of her wine to wet her throat. The honey sat heavy on her tongue, and she wouldn't cry. She wouldn't. The Coyote tapped the base of his wineglass thoughtfully on the tabletop, and then moved one of his pieces. Robin had no idea to what advantage the move was, but she was sure that there had to be one. She leaned in, pretending to study the board. She raised her hand to her chin to make herself look thoughtful, blocking the view of her mouth from the room. She had no idea if anyone was peeking at them through the wall panels or from behind the curtains, but paranoia had begun to infect her. "Who did they take from you? Who are they threatening?" She reached down with her free hand and played the first piece she touched. The Coyote stretched his mouth at her, reviving that uncomfortable smile, but didn't answer. He played a second piece. "It's someone, though," Robin pressed, playing her second piece, copying what he did because she had no space in her head to keep the rules straight just now, "or you wouldn't be cooperating." "So who?" The Coyote played his third piece, then raised a glass to hide his lips. "Did I not call you clever, my dear?" He paused, a small bit of anguish flickering across his face before he steeled it. "I have a brother, a boastful man who praised the flying ability of his sibling far too often to far too many of the wrong people. And that is all I will say." Robin's eyes cut to the portrait. The younger boy stared back at her, helpless and vulnerable looking. Robin played her next piece and hissed, "But you could just fly away. I don't understand. You have an airship." "And where would I go?" the Coyote asked. "The Bene will not take me. Franken is aggressively neutral and will harbor neither fugitives nor deserters. No airship could fly as far as Telmium, and pirates litter the skies above the deserts. I am just a man, and my king has ordered my cooperation. Or else." "If this is all true, then I feel sorry for you," Robin ground out, "but I still won't help you do whatever it is that you need mid-flights for." The Coyote shook his head. He wasn't going to discuss it here. "My dear," he began and said. "Stop calling me that!" Robin snapped. "I'm not your anything." The Coyote folded his hands in his lap and regarded her thoughtfully. "You gave me no name to call you by. Shall I call you simply the pilot with the robin-nosed glider?" The thought that he might use that to guess her true name filled Robin with dread. She wished suddenly that Al had chosen any other bird to decorate her aircraft with. Now that she had a better idea of who her enemy was, it made her extremely uneasy to think that her captors knew even that small truth about her. Any other bird, she thought, dithering, mind racing. The memory of the two brown birds in the sky above the crash, crying out their fierce joy, bubbled into her mind. "If you have to call me something, call me Skylark." The Coyote's mouth twisted. "The Skylark and the Coyote. It sounds like a child's tale." Robin shot him a surprised glance. "Yes, I know what your people call me. I find I prefer it over the moniker the king has chosen for me, Wolves Hunt. Coyotes scavenge. Robin took several deep breaths, flickering her eyes around the room and reaching out to push one of the foot soldiers on her side of the board towards a space. And that's what our hosts do? Scavenge? The coyote met her steady gaze and winked. Tech? He tapped his glass again. Robin thought for a moment, recalled the question she had asked her in the forest, and wasn't sure she liked where her memory was leading her. Mid-flights, she whispered, trying not to move her mouth at all. He winked again. Why? He tapped his glass. Then where are they? He tapped. Robin flopped back in the chair, hollow and gutted. Adam and John, and all the mid-flights she'd known who'd been shot down. Gone. Hauled away, probably screaming as they watched the coyote stab their pilots through the heart, like Robin had watched him desecrate Al. Robin wondered where those mid-flights were now. Don't be stupid, she scolded herself. It's obvious. They're dead, or he wouldn't have needed you. She looked up and found that he was watching her, waiting, it seemed, as she put the pieces of the puzzle into a coherent pattern. She grimaced. He smiled again, and the light, confident tone crept back into his voice, making it richer, more enticing. Ah, there it is. I will never forget the first time I saw that churning scowl under your goggles. Although, if I may, it looks even more charming with your hair as it is now. The juxtaposition with your skin tone is striking. It suits you. Performing again. Was the flirtation performance as well, or did he really think that he could charm her? Robin rolled her eyes and forced herself not to snap at him. She was not some stupid girl to have her head turned with silver-tongued compliments, especially when they came from the lips of her enemy, and he was still her enemy, no matter the protestations of his own captivity, no matter the shared meals and the wine and the apparent protectiveness. So it was me you were after then? And your mid-flight as well, 2 at the cost of 1. Quite a bargain for my efforts. Robin gawped at him, horrified. Don't trivialize it. We are at war, Skylark, he replied sadly. You must forgive a soldier his gallows humor. I don't have to forgive you for anything, Robin snapped. The coyote set his wineglass down with enough force that the game pieces rattled. You could thank me, then, at least, he snarled, frustration bubbling up in him. The congenial facade cracked, and for the first time Robin saw a glimpse of the raging firestorm that surged below it. She saw the danger in him across the table that she had always known was there when they faced off in the sky. Believe me, the courtesies extended to you tonight were not solely the result of your sex. No other we have held has ever had the pleasure of bathing or a fine meal. Robin puffed out a laugh. Oh, sorry, but you want me to thank you? Ha! He looked wounded for a moment, like he really had expected her to be grateful. Mind yourself, he warned, but he was projecting again, raising his voice for their unseen audience, as if there were more than just the seneschal watching. The cold pantry is uncomfortable at night. Robin scoffed. Oh, isn't that a bit barbaric, threatening to lock a prisoner in a food cupboard? Come now, enough of this. Be reasonable, and we can— Nema! That last order was directed towards someone standing behind her. Robin leapt up and turned. The seneschal stood there, those damn thick carpets. She hadn't even heard him enter the room, and before Robin could properly duck, he laid the back of his hand across her face. The inside of her cheek bashed against the edge of her teeth, and Robin tasted blood. The slap was meant to insult more than hurt, and her cheeks burned with the humiliation of it. Blood dribbled from the corner of her lips. Robin, never one to walk away from a fistfight, hauled back and let fly. The coyote intercepted, catching her wrist easily. Let go, she snapped. No, he said, gaze darting between Robin and the seneschal. I did warn you, my dear Skylark. Now you have left me no choice. Go ahead, then, Robin snarled, defiant, glaring up at him. Kill me. Lock me in an icebox. I don't care. Whatever it is you're collecting us up for, I won't do it. I won't agree to anything, or tell you anything, or do anything, so you might as well just get it over with now. The Coyote yanked on her wrist, pulling her back around the game table and back against his chest, mouth directly on her ear as he hissed, I convinced them to treat you like a lady. I told them you were a Bene noblewoman, and it is for that reason alone that they have not taken any further liberties. If they do not kill you outright, they will send you to a prison camp, and you must know as well as I the fate of a Seelie woman within those walls. Panic seized her, and Robin froze in dread, breath whooshing out in horror. All thoughts of a quiet escape with scores of intelligence fled. All she knew was that she could not let the Coyote ensnare her, not with his pretty words, or his charms, or his calculating kindness, or even his false, cold cruelty. She could not let him trick her into compliance, but more than that, she could not let her send him to the camps. She had to get away. Trust me, he had asked of her, and for what? To trick me? To use me? What is his game? Groping out with one hand, her fingers seized on his wineglass. She shoved it into the seneschal's face, splashing the wine into the eyes to blind him, cracking the crystal against his temple. He jerked back, roaring, and she wriggled free of the Coyote, grip loosened just enough in his shock. As quick as she was able, she ran to the door, ignoring the throb of her abused ankle. She threw herself bodily at the wood, wrenching at the knob. Locked! Right! Clever bastard, they are way too thorough by half! Robin slammed against the door, putting all of her considerable mid-flight muscle into the effort. The hinges groaned, but didn't give. Had she enough time, she thought she might have been able to loosen them enough to get the door open, but the seneschal was already coming at her, his face a mask of rage. Robin ducked to the side and dashed to the fireplace, searching for a weapon. There was no poker, no great broom. She grabbed at the end of a slim burning log and whirled around to brandish it at the seneschal. He stopped up short, just as aware as she that the wine soaking his clothes would go up in a brilliant blaze the moment Robin touched him with the flame. Behind him, the Coyote's face was painted with an irritated snarl. Enough! He snarled. Unlock the door, she demanded, and release me. No, he laughed, and then, before Robin even saw it coming, the Coyote crossed the room, lunged forward, and batted the burning log right out of her hand. It rolled across the carpet, the flame snuffing instead of setting it ablaze. Cease this. Never gonna happen, Robin snarled, sidestepping his snatching hands. Going to, the Coyote corrected. Stop pretending! Stop acting like you actually care what happens to me! Robin shouted at him, ignoring the strain on her ribs as she crouched and scrambled for her boot knife. She came back up, brandishing it. You killed Al! The Coyote took a step back, surprise written around his eyes at the sight of the blade, that she dared to draw it in front of the seneschal to point it at him. Skylark, he warned, low and dangerous, listen to me. You wounded Wade, and you shot down dozens of gliders. You! Robin sobbed, but there was no curse, no epithet, no word big enough, black enough to encompass the totality of the hatred she felt. 53. The Coyote corrected, tone carefully indifferent, cold, clinical, flippant. The seneschal straightened from his wary crouch and took a small step back, out of the range of Robin's blade. Robin was so aghast at the calculated flatness of the Coyote's tone that she actually had to gasp against the shock. You think that's funny? No, I do not. The Coyote said, lips twisting with what looked like genuine sorrow. A somber sort of seriousness fell over him, like a too heavy cloak. How many of us have you shot down? I don't keep track, she said, defensive. It's not a scorecard. I've got more respect for lives than that. 61, the Coyote supplied, stepping closer, arms down and to the side. 61 Klonn soldiers, shot down by the pilot in the robin-nosed glider, and in far fewer skirmishes than it took for me to achieve a similar count. The seneschal shifted forward, assuming she was distracted, and Robin swung the knife in an arc towards his thigh, but the seneschal was too tall. His reach was greater, and he had hold of her wrist before the blow landed. He squeezed, grinding the bones of her arm together. Robin clamped down on the little pained grunt that wanted to escape and fought to keep her grip on the knife. Her fingers went numb, and the choice was stolen from her. As soon as her blade thumped into the carpeting, harmless, the seneschal swung her arm back, forcing it down. Robin cried out as the seneschal spun her swiftly to the side and stepped up behind her, his free hand suddenly clutching her throat, fingers pressed with just enough force against her windpipe to let her know that he meant business. The seneschal growled something in guttural Klonnish, and the coyote's face soured around the edges, resignation flickering in his eyes. "Nema," he said, with a pointed look at Robin. "I will do it." "Aide," the seneschal said, and then stepped aside so the coyote could take his place. He pushed her forward, frog-marching her to the door. Robin considered flinging her head back and trying to bash his nose with her skull, but she was simply too short. The best she could do was bruise herself on his breastbone. Robin was shoved out the door and dragged down the hall. They turned into what was clearly a servant's passageway, barren and narrow, and marched through an empty kitchen. "You meant an actual cold pantry?" Robin goggled as they stopped before a barred doorway. Behind her, the coyote sighed, faint and warm against the back of her neck. "Did you think it a lie? You must learn, my dear, to listen when I warn you. You are making it hard for me to spare you, and I do not relish punishments such as these. Now, please, stay. Do not make this worse." Slowly, he let go of her throat and arm. When Robin didn't move, he crossed to the pantry door and unlocked it, opening it wide. He met her gaze then, and for a brief flash of a moment, Robin saw sadness, hurt, and concern flicker behind the resignation and cruel glint. She didn't understand him, didn't understand anything about her situation, but she refused to let them, see her cowed. She was stronger than she looked. She always had been. She could handle whatever they put her through. So long as she could dream of the sky, she could survive. So long as she lived, she could escape. Head held high, shoulders back, Robin walked inside the little closet of her own accord. She turned and met the coyote's gaze with a glare, daring him to do it, to shut her up inside. The door slammed, locking her in with the smell of must and slow rot. There was just enough light under the door to throw wavering shadows up against the bare stone walls. The closet was narrow and small, hardly big enough for her to stretch out in, lined with empty racks that, judging by the sour smell that permeated the stained wood, had once held rows of wine bottles. A small wooden box in the corner held ice packed in filthy straw, which made it unsafe to drink the ice melt if she got thirsty later. A few greasy old waxed wrappers littered the floor, reeking of the raw meat they must have once contained. Ugh. Robin tore at the buttons on her gown, wanting to get the stink of her captors off her. Bile rose in her throat, the wine and the cake and the rice all mingling into a hard, angry ball in her gut. Her fingers shook and the fabric refused to rip, and she forced herself to slow down and undo each of the small buttons one at a time, her fingers shaking so hard that, by the end of the row, it took her 4 tries to undo the last one, throwing her into even more of an impotent rage. Robin sucked hard on the air, which suddenly felt too thick to make its way past the burning stone that had appeared at the root of her tongue. Anger was threatening to crawl into her limbs, and she shut it away. Having a temper tantrum would do her no good. "I can't panic like that again," she told herself. "He's right. I was outclassed. I can't just swing my fists and expect it to turn out in my favor. I have to use my brain. God damn it!" She threw the dress against the wall, and it landed with a completely unsatisfactory whisper on the floor. Robin breathed hard and refused to scream, refused to rail or weep or any of the weak womanly things the coyote obviously sought to wring from her. Instead, she probed the cut on the inside of her mouth with her tongue and yearned for the clear, fresh air of the sky with every miserable part of herself.
Give up when more down. Fly as long as you can.